Welcome back, everyone, to the final part of our look at Extra Histories series on Buddhist expansion. I've been learning a ton. I hope you have as well, and I want to especially thank all of the members of the VTH community who are also Buddhist, who have been sharing your own insights and your just appreciation that we're covering this topic that means so much to you. I'm glad we're able to do that, and I'm glad that I've been able to learn a lot about a subject I know very little. So I'm excited to learn more. We are learning history together. That's what the banner says on the channel, and I have meant that from day one, continue to mean it to this day. So give a thank you to Chansey in Lusk, Wyoming. Wyoming is a beautiful state, one of my favorite places I've visited. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon, and thank you to all of the new patrons. We've had several new patrons who have signed up in the last couple of days during this series. I appreciate each and every one of you, and we are doing a live stream. Actually, the day that this video goes live to the public, we're also doing a live stream for our patrons and members at 5 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. Hope to see you there. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
China, 645 CE. The imperial court is abuzz with the news. The monk Xuanzang has returned. 16 years before, he'd left on an epic journey to visit the Buddhist heartland of India with the goal of returning with the true sutras. His path, he tells the emperor, was perilous. He was menaced by brigands on the Silk Road and saw colossal jeweled Buddha statues in the kingdoms of Afghanistan. In India, he'd crossed rivers filled with poisoned dragons and converted a group of ferocious cave dwellers. And there, he saw the great stupas of Ashoka, studied under Himalayan masters, and witnessed debates between the followers of the old Theravada ways and his allies in the Mahayana tradition.
So at this point, we're over 1,000 years after the lifetime of Buddha. This is also right around the time that Islam is becoming a thing further to the west. So by this point, Rome, the Roman Empire, or what's left of it, is Christian. Europe is starting to form. You've got the Franks. You're going to, in another couple of generations, you're going to have the advent of the dynasty that's going to lead to Charlemagne and to really kind of the modern nations of Europe like Germany and France and things like that that are eventually going to grow out of all of that. So interesting to see what's happening now in the eastern part of Europe and Asia during all of this. And it's also interesting to think about the fact that, at least for me personally, when I think of Buddhism, the country that comes to mind is Tibet, which is north of China. And of course, what we're learning in all of this is that Buddhism's real roots and its real heart are in India. But now, of course, that's being brought back to places like China. And last episode, we learned how it was brought to Southeast Asia.
And now, he's returned with 657 Sanskrit texts, statues of the Buddha, 100 relics, and 3 copies of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. But when offered a high position as a reward, he declines. He has translating to do. And those very translations will change Asia forever. Thanks so much to Incogni for supporting today's historical tale. Traditionally, there are considered to be 3 large groups in Buddhism: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And cards on the table, we're not going to get too far into Vajrayana here. It's very much its own very complicated thing, and diverts far enough from the others that it'd be hard to do it justice. But briefly, Vajrayana, also known as Tibetan Buddhism, Tantric Buddhism, or Esoteric Buddhism, uses elaborate rituals, practices, and visualization techniques that are meant to help unlock the internal Buddha nature of the practitioner and alleviate suffering. Things like chanting secret mantras, ritual aids like mandalas and daggers, the Dalai Lama, and Tantra paintings. This is all Vajrayana.
See, this is like, to me, to my American, very limited understanding of all of Buddhism and just Asian history in general, that's when I think of Buddhism. I think of the Dalai Lama. I think of Tibet. I think of like portrayals like you see in the movie 2012 where they show the Tibetan monks up in the mountains. But as, of course, we're learning here, that's just one small branch of Buddhism.
Vajrayana was also the dominant form of Buddhism in medieval Indonesia and also influenced several well-known esoteric sects across Asia, most famously Zen Buddhism. Also, it should be noted, it's Western pop culture's favorite type of Buddhism,
There you
since
go.
it has an aesthetic that's easy to map onto stories of adventure and mysticism. Here you can kind of think Doctor Strange or Uncharted 2.
Yep.
Now, you'd think that due to its large cultural footprint, Vajrayana would be one of the biggest Buddhist groups, but it's actually the smallest, only making up about 6% of Buddhists.
It's kind of like how there are certain aspects of Islam that everybody thinks are dominant. Like, when we think of, for example, Islam, a lot of people immediately identify with like radical Islam, but that's not who most Muslims are. Or Christianity, whenever we see Christian pastors portrayed in culture, they're either right-wing psychos or they're like a Catholic priest wearing, the outfit of a Catholic priest. And neither one of those represent so much of Christianity. I mean, I realize Catholicism is huge, but we do, with every religion, with every cultural identity, we have things that are easily identifiable, so they get portrayed that way in fiction very often.
Theravada, the next largest, makes up about 36%, and over half of Buddhists, around 53% in one recent poll, identify with the Mahayana school. Though calling it a school is an oversimplification. The Mahayana tradition is incredibly diverse, more a loose family of beliefs and teachings, often contradictory, than a unified group. So it's better understood as an umbrella term like Protestantism. Mahayana probably arose from a host of different beliefs that began developing around the turn of the millennium, and were later grouped together. These usually took the form of newer sutras that Theravada didn't recognize in its canon, like the Lotus Sutra or Perfection of Wisdom. Speaking very, very, very broadly, what makes Mahayana different is a belief that there have been many Buddhas, some of them avatars or rebirths of a previous Buddha. According
Kind
to
of like the Avatar. I get it.
Mahayana traditions, instead of becoming a Buddha and exiting the cycle of life and death, these celestial bodhisattvas have decided to forego that piece of non-existence and reside in heaven-like realms, sometimes known as the Pure Land, where they can affect our world through their compassion. In fact, the objective of Mahayana is to become a bodhisattva yourself in order to further alleviate suffering and save others. As a result, much like Hinduism or Chinese folk religion, Mahayana actually has a pantheon of celestial bodhisattvas, and that's no accident.
Like saints.
Because though it began in India, it was in China that Mahayana Buddhism really took off. The religion came across the Silk Road via trading caravans, imported through the Central Asian region Ashoka had converted.
So we mentioned the Silk Road in yesterday's episode and how much of history is determined by trade routes. Trade routes lead to settlements. They lead to the spread of religion and culture. They lead to wars. They lead to all of that stuff.
But it was frequently oral at first, until the 7th century, when a series of monks, like Xuanzang mentioned at the start of this episode, made the perilous journey to bring back and translate sutras. And just a sidebar real quick, Xuanzang's Ibn Battuta-like travelogue would later be mythologized into the epic Journey to the West, where Xuanzang is demoted as main character in favor of the Monkey King, whose origins you can see in our episode here. Exactly why Mahayana changed when it hit China is still debated among academics. One leading theory suggests that translating these Sanskrit sutras into Chinese, by its very nature, made them more culturally Chinese. And that's certainly possible, but a rival theory holds that these beliefs were intentionally adapted in order to appeal to Chinese religious tastes.
So translating something into another language always has its difficulties. The common example that is used in Christianity is the word love, which in English we have a word, love. The way I say I love my children is different than what I mean when I say I love my girlfriend or my wife, or I love football. Those are all very, very different expressions of love. And in Greek, which the New Testament was originally written in, those are all different words. You have phileo and eros and agape, which mean, agape is unconditional love, and eros is kind of that sexual love, and phileo is brotherly love, and they mean different things. But when you translate them all into love, well, it loses some of that. It's the same with whenever people always quote John 3:16, which says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." You think of that word believe and you think, well, yeah, I believe in God, but what that word there means is deeper than just belief in something. It's trust. It's the example I use is if you're standing at the Grand Canyon and there's a rope across and a guy's got a wheelbarrow and he says, "Do you believe I can push this wheelbarrow across the Grand Canyon?" And you're like, "Yeah, I believe you can do that." That's different than jumping in the wheelbarrow. That's a different kind of belief, a different level of belief, and that's what that word meant there. That's a long way of saying that I understand that translating text from one culture and one language to another culture and another language is inherently going to bring problems, even if they're not intentional.
After all, the term Mahayana, meaning greater vehicle, actually comes from a parable about attracting converts. In the story, a father realizes his house is on fire and wants his children to exit quickly. So he shouts that he has several carts or vehicles for them to play with. Each child will get the cart that they like best. When the kids run out, it's revealed that there's actually only one big cart for all of them, the greater vehicle of Mahayana. The moral lesson being that, provided you bring people to enlightenment, the specific rhetoric you use is not important. You say whatever's needed to save them from the fire. So, Mahayana evolved into what's frequently called East Asian Mahayana, particularly by both absorbing local gods and changing its own bodhisattvas. For example, the male
Okay, I get it. So in other words, it's fine if you believe in all this other stuff as long as it gets you to the same destination. All right, makes sense.
Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, morphed along the Silk Road into Guanyin, female bodhisattva of mercy, whose following is one of the greatest in China. Similarly, you might think that this guy is supposed to be Siddhartha Gautama, but if you do, you'd be wrong, because that is the wandering generous monk Budai, who is likely an existing figure in Chinese folklore that Buddhism adopted. He's associated with prosperity and material gain, which is why you often see him in businesses. But that...
So, again, thinking of parallels with Christianity, there's, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul addresses how some Christians were still holding to Jewish rituals like circumcision and abstaining from certain foods, and other Christians weren't doing that. And he was being very critical of the people who were saying, you have to do it this way, or you have to do it this way. And he was saying, listen, if one person doesn't want to eat certain foods, fine, let them. Just don't expect everybody else to do the same thing and tell them it's necessary. The end goal is faith in Christ, it's salvation. What you do to practice that, not as important. Those kinds of things. Now, there are certain doctrinal things that do matter, but those things don't. So I can kind of see where that's coming from. And again, I'm processing all of this through my own religious understanding to try and make those parallels to make it easier for me to understand what's happening with Buddhism.
That is kind of bananas, right? Because Buddhism was originally based around asceticism and self-denial, and it's morphed into one where you can pray and make offerings in hopes of getting rich. Well, yeah,
Christianity has that too, the prosperity gospel, right? If you have enough faith, God will bless you and you'll be rich and wealthy and all this stuff, which goes completely, it's the antithesis of what Jesus taught.
Buddhism was spread by merchants. But more than that, it became hierarchical. While it originally opposed the Indian caste system, Buddhism morphed to fit with Confucian principles of societal order. Violence, too, became a bigger part of Eastern Asian Buddhism. Monks living in one bandit-ridden province found themselves being ambushed on the road and developed self-defense techniques involving both unarmed combat and with walking sticks. By the 16th century, monks from this temple, Shaolin, were known far and wide for their martial arts. Mahayana Buddhism spread rapidly in East Asia, sweeping through China and into its major trade partners like Vietnam and Korea, where it gained a foothold by the 8th through 10th centuries. Though a major blow came during the Mongol invasions, which destroyed a huge number of monasteries. But ironically, the Mongol Yuan emperors of China ended up converting and helped rebuild the institutions their ancestors destroyed. But then when Buddhism crossed the Sea of Japan, it hit a barrier. Japan, an island archipelago cut off.
Kind of the story of history, though, right? Everything hits a barrier when it tries to cross the sea to Japan.
From mainland Asia, was deeply rooted in a unique animist belief system called Shinto, which initially proved hostile. When Buddhism first entered Japan in 552 CE, imported by immigrants from Korea, the emperor supposedly staged a test. He allowed one noble to worship a Buddha sculpture, just to see what it could do. But then when a smallpox epidemic broke out, the emperor panicked. Thinking he'd angered the Shinto spirits, he'd ordered the Buddha image thrown in the river. Then the epidemic promptly got worse and the palace caught fire, so they fished the statue out and apologized, giving Buddhism official recognition. Then a later monarch, Prince Shotoku, would be largely responsible for popularizing the faith through temple building and patronage. Yet Buddhism would never be the sole religion of Japan. The emperors were careful to keep Shintoism and Buddhism in a state of coexistence, because Buddhism had something very useful: an afterlife. One of the things that sets Mahayana apart from Shintoism and the other sects of Buddhism is the idea we mentioned earlier of rebirth in a pure land. These celestial realms are perfected planes of existence shaped by powerful bodhisattvas like Guanyin, and adherents can be reborn there after death through devotion, special chants, or in one case, by repeating the name of a certain Buddha. In these realms, all distractions and suffering are removed, and a reborn person can become a bodhisattva over a single lifetime. And that was an attractive prospect, since Shinto doesn't have a very well-defined afterlife. In fact, to this day, Japanese people often live by the saying, born a Shinto, die a Buddhist, where they adhere to both faiths, but allow Buddhist clergy to handle their funeral arrangements. Now, we know we've covered a lot during this series, and we could talk pretty endlessly about this topic, from how monasteries could become powerful city-states, or even the twisting of Buddhism in World War II. But that's really all the time we have for now. However, we hope that we've given you a basis for understanding how this fascinating religion both spread and altered. From the mind of one man in ancient India came a concept that would change the world and change itself in that process. A faith of humble temples and golden statues, of warrior monks and peaceful kings. A religion that came to be both without a god and pay homage to a pantheon of celestial beings. A beautiful, unified contradiction, with the same mantras chanted from the tops of the Himalayas to the coasts of Indonesia. Truly, a world of enlightenment.
All right, I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. We're also going to be, at some point in the near future, looking at some of the early Islamic expansion so that we can understand a little more about that. Understanding religion is a big window into understanding history. It's one of those lenses through which we can view and understand history. So I hope you don't mind all of my own religion kind of seeping into that. It just helps me to understand and process all of this better. And maybe it helps some of you to relate to it better as well. So I want to say thank you to Janine in Weir, New Hampshire, and Fred in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, right over there by Valley Forge. I've been to the King of Prussia Mall a few times. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Hopefully I'll see a bunch of you at the stream. Thanks for watching.